Hello everyone and welcome to this video. Today we're talking about the chapter Electrostatics. Now electrostatics is the first chapter of your volume 2 in physics, and it is the first chapter where we will introduce the concepts of electricity and magnetism. Physics 1, that is volume 1, was all about mechanics, thermodynamics and wave mechanics. So this is the chapter that will lay the foundation for volume 2. Now this chapter is very important because all the concepts that you will learn will help you to deal with the coming chapters. So let's begin with electrostatics. We first revise all the properties of electric charge that we know. So we know that the idea and discussion on electric charge began with the concept of static electricity. In static electricity, we rub two objects together and charges were developed on these objects. And these charges remained in place, that is, they were static charges. And this by definition gave us what is known as the definition of electrostatics. Electrostatics is the study of electricity or electric charges which are at rest, that is, they are static, and this study is known as electrostatics. So we know the very famous example where when a glass rod is rubbed on silk and it gets electrified. On being electrified, when this glass rod is taken close to bits of paper, these bits of paper are attracted to the glass rod. And therefore we saw that bodies like glass or plastic rods, silk fur and pith balls are all electrified on rubbing, and they acquire an electric charge on rubbing. These were the first examples of electric charge, of the discovery of electricity. From here, we also revise the other properties of electric charges that we know. When two glass rods are electrified by rubbing on silk, we see that they repel each other. And this gave us the property that like charges repel each other. Conversely, if one glass rod and the silk cloth which were rubbed against each other are placed close to each other, we see that there is an attractive force between them, and here we learned that unlike charges attract each other. We also learned that when the glass rod is being rubbed on the silk cloth, what is actually happening is that each of them acquire charge. And not only do they acquire charge, this charge is opposite and equal in both of them. And if you touch them again after rubbing, you will see that these charges are nullified. That is, if we bring the two objects which got charged by rubbing close to each other, then the charged bodies, when brought in contact, will lose their electrification because they will neutralize each other's effect. And this taught us that the effect on both of these must have been opposite. That is, both must be oppositely charged and equally oppositely charged, because when brought next to each other after rubbing, they neutralize each other's effect, unlike charges acquired by the objects neutralize or nullify each other's object. Now, the next question to ask is, how do material bodies even acquire any charge? Now, to electrify any neutral body, because in general bodies are uncharged or neutral, to electrify such a body, we need to either add an extra charge or remove an existing charge. So we say that electrification requires us to add or remove one kind of charge. For example, in the case of the glass rod and the silk cloth, we saw that the glass rod was actually giving away electrons, and therefore I can say that the glass rod, which is positively charged, is actually suffering from a deficit of electrons. So in this case, it is suffering from a deficit of negative charge and it has extra positive charge. On the other hand, the negatively charged silk cloth has extra electrons and is suffering from a deficit of positive charge. So in general, bodies get charged due to the deficit or the excess of one kind of charge. However, when it comes to solid conductors, it is only the electrons that can move because they are not that tightly bound to the atom. And therefore, in the case of solid conductors, we see that it is only electrons that are transferred from one body to another. So how exactly can we charge objects? There are particularly three methods of charging. The first one we have already seen, that is charging by friction. When we take two objects and rub them against each other, we see that they both get electrified with equal and opposite charges, and therefore this is charging by friction, which appears when two bodies are rubbed against each other. The most important thing to remember about charging by friction is that it can only happen with certain kinds of material. For example, we know that only when you take a glass rod next to pieces of paper, or you take something like nylon or plastic, you rub it on your hair and you take it next to pieces of paper, yes, the pieces of paper get attracted. But what if you had something like a metal scale? Will static electricity actually work? Will the papers be attracted? The answer is no. And this is because charging by friction can only be achieved in insulators. You can't achieve them in conductors like metals. And why is that? This is because even if you charge a metal scale by rubbing it, you'll see that the charge will not remain in its place. Why? Because it's a conductor, so the charge will start flowing through the metal scale onto your body and to the ground. And therefore, we say that the charges on metal leak through our body to the ground, as both are conductors of electricity. And therefore, charge will never stay on a conductor, and therefore, there will be nothing like electrostatics. And therefore, we say that if you want to charge a material by friction, you need insulators. The second type of charging is the charging by conduction. In charging by conduction, you bring a charged body close to an uncharged body and you actually touch it. And therefore, contact is important for charging by conduction. Therefore, we say that the charging of an uncharged conductor by coming in contact with a charged conductor is called charging by conduction. So in this case, as you can see, I have taken a positively charged glass rod and I am touching this uncharged ball with it. And therefore, what will happen is that the positive charge will transfer to the ball, and this charge will spread on the ball under the action of its own repulsion, and therefore what we will get is a charged ball. Notice that the wire which is holding the charge will be obviously made up of an insulating material. Otherwise, this charge which we have just put on the ball will just get conducted through the wire, and therefore the ball will not remain charged. So one thing you want to notice is that in conduction, you actually charge the object by the same charge, that is by the same sign which the charging object had. For example, the glass rod had positive charge and the ball also has positive charge. So you can only charge with the same sign if you do charging by conduction. The exact opposite happens in charging by induction. First of all, in charging by induction, we don't really touch the object. We only bring the charged object close to the object. And secondly, in charging by induction, we actually charge it with the opposite sign. So let's see how. Initially, we should realize that in general, any object is electrically neutral and therefore it will have an equal number of positive and negative charges. However, when I bring a charged object close to it, for example, when I bring this negatively charged glass rod close to this ball, I see that there is a distribution of charges. This redistribution of charges in such a way that positive charge remains on the surface which is close to the negatively charged glass rod, and the negative charged electrons move far away under the repulsion from the glass rod. Now you can see that I have not actually touched the ball. I have just brought this negatively charged rod close to the ball. Now obviously what will happen is that if you remove this glass rod from the picture, all these charges will again redistribute and come back to their original position. But doesn't that mean that we have not actually charged it? It was only charged under the effect of this outside charged body. So what do we do to permanently charge such an object? To charge such an object permanently, what we do is we bring the glass rod back. The negatively charged glass rod, when brought next to this ball again, will cause this redistribution of charges. And now what we will do is connect this ball from the further end towards the earth. What happens here is that the electrons or the negative charges from the ball will all get transferred to the earth, because the earth is a great conductor, and what will remain on the ball is simply just the positive charge, which will then, on removing the glass rod, be uniformly distributed over the ball, and what you get is a charged ball. So here you can see the charge remains even when the glass rod is removed. So this process of sharing the charges with the earth is called grounding or earthing, and we have, using this, successfully charged this ball through induction. Finally, let's now see some basic properties of electric charges. The first property is very well known. It is that charges can be added algebraically. For example, if you have a large number of charges, here we have +3, -1, +4, -2, -1 and +5, they have to simply be added algebraically, and therefore the answer, that is the addition of these charges, will just be +3, +4, +5, which is +12, -1, -2, -1, which is -4, and therefore the addition of these charges will be 8. So first property is that charges can directly be added. The second property is that charge is conserved, and this we saw because when a glass rod is rubbed with silk, the amount of charge that is produced on the glass rod is exactly equal and opposite to the amount of charge produced on the silk cloth, which means that in total the net charge is still 0, so we can say that charge is conserved. The third property of charge is that it is quantized. So quantization of charge means that the smallest unit of charge is an electron. So we have units of different quantities, like we say we are going to buy 5 kgs of sugar. Similarly, the unit of electric charge is a coulomb, but even 1 coulomb is a really big unit of charge, and this is because actually the smallest unit of charge is 1 electron. We can't have half an electron and a quarter electron, and since an electron is the charge carrier, we say that it is the smallest unit of charge. So here we say that charge is quantized because you cannot have any number less than 1 electron, and again you can't have 1.5 electron and you can't have 1.75 electron. The next available charge value is 2 times the electron or 3 electrons or 4 electrons, and therefore we say that the electric field is actually grainy, that is, it is quantized, it is broken down into units of E only. So actually speaking, when we see the nature of the electric field, we'll see that it is grainy, it is made up of small units of electrons. But usually we don't talk about in number of electrons, we talk about it in number of coulombs, and therefore we normally forget that these electrons are actually small units and we are not looking at any units smaller than this. In most applications, the grainy nature of charge is not visible. This is something like looking at the different points in a line. If you look at them from very close up, you will see that one point is very different from each other. You can actually count them as separate. However, when you look at these same points from really far away, you will see that what appears is just a line. And this is exactly what happens in the case of the electric charge. We never really notice that the electric charge at its base level is made up only of electrons. The most fundamental and the most important law of electrostatics is arguably the Coulomb's law. Coulomb's law gives us the force acting between two electric charges. The electric charge is the manifestation of the electric field. As you can see, here we have two charges, Q1 and Q2, and they both are positive. In this case, Coulomb's law says that the force acting between these two charges, which are separated by a distance of r, is given in magnitude by the formula that F is equal to K Q1 Q2 upon R square. Now note one very important thing. This equation is telling me only the magnitude of the force between these two charges, and therefore you can also see that the product Q1 Q2 is placed under the absolute sign, telling me that this sign is not important. All I need is the product. This K, which is the constant of proportionality in Coulomb's law, comes out to be 1 upon 4 pi epsilon naught, and we get the formula for the magnitude of the force acting between the charges as F is equal to 1 upon 4 pi epsilon naught Q1 Q2 upon R square. But I also want to talk something very important with respect to Coulomb's law. I want to show you how Coulomb's law operates vectorially. For this, we say that we need some origin with respect to which these electric charges are placed. Let's say that our origin is O. And then we can find out and indicate R1 is the position vector of charge Q1, R2 is the position vector of charge Q2. Now I'm saying that the force is acting between these two charges, but what is the direction of this force? We know that these two charges are positive and like charges repel each other, and therefore I will indicate the force acting on Q2 due to Q1. This force directed from Q1 towards Q2 will be away from Q2 and will be acting towards the right as shown. Similarly, Q2 will also repel Q1 and therefore the force on Q1 will be acting towards the left as shown. Now I want to ask what is the direction of each of these forces and how will I write them down vectorially? The answer to this is that first we have to find out this between vector, that is the vector between the distance Q1 and Q2, and this vector we will call as R. As you can see, the first type of force that I am trying to find out is the force acting on Q2 due to Q1, and the force acting on Q2 due to Q1 will be directed from Q1 towards Q2, and therefore the R that I have marked in between is pointing towards Q2, and therefore the force which is pointing away from Q2, which is a repulsive force, is labeled as F21 because it denotes the force on Q2 due to Q1. And as you can see, F21 and R21 are in the same direction, and therefore when I'm trying to write the vector equation for the force, I will use a unit cap vector which is in the direction of R21. So see what I have done. I am saying that the vector leading from Q1 to Q2 is R21, which is given again by the displacement formula, that is R2 minus R1, and I write down the vector equation for the force acting on 2 due to 1, and you can see that in the vector notation I have written R21 cap. So I am using the unit vector acting along R21 to indicate the direction of F21 because they are in the same direction. We can do the same thing when it comes to finding out the force acting on Q1 due to Q2. This time the vector, the displacement vector in between will point the other way, and therefore I have called it R12, and the force will be F12 because we are writing down the force acting on 1 due to 2, and therefore I say that the vector leading from Q2 to Q1 is R12 given by the formula R1 minus R2, and this is nothing but the opposite of the previous vector, that's minus R21, and in this case I can write down the force F12 vectorially as 1 upon 4 pi epsilon 0 q1 q2 upon r12 square and r12 cap. So you can see here now I'm using the direction of the unit vector r12 because now r12 and f12 are in the same direction. And this force is exactly opposite in direction to the previous force F21. So I see that F12 is equal to minus F21. This tells me that these two forces are equal and opposite to each other. So this gives me the vector form of the Coulomb's law. Finally, I also want to say that if charges are placed instead in matter, for example, everything that we have discussed so far for Coulomb's law was when these charges are placed in vacuum. Instead of vacuum, if you have some material in which they are placed, then in that case you have to replace epsilon naught with epsilon naught k, where k will be the dielectric constant of that medium given by the ratio of epsilon upon epsilon naught. Now, Coulomb's law only told us about the force acting on a single charge due to another single charge. But what happens when the force on a charge is because of several charges around it? In such a case, we have to use what is known as the principle of superposition. Coulomb's law and principle of superposition can arguably take on the entire of electrostatics. The principle of superposition is thus a very important principle, and it basically says this. It says that the force on any charge due to a number of other charges is the vector sum of all the forces on that charge due to the other charges taken one at a time. The individual forces are unaffected due to the presence of other charges. Now, what does this mean? It means that if you have a situation in which you have to find out the force acting on any one charge due to many other charges, what you have to do is look at each pair separately. For example, here in my XYZ coordinate system, I have, as you can see, 3 charges. Now, I want to find out what is the total force acting on Q1 due to Q2 plus due to Q3, and what I will do is apply Coulomb's law in pairs. That is, first I will write down the value of the force acting between Q1 and Q2, assuming that Q3 does not affect this interaction at all. So ignore Q3 for 1 second and write down the force acting between Q1 and Q2. Then ignore Q2 and write down the force acting between Q1 and Q3 and simply add them vectorially. So let's see how we can perform this. Let's say that the position vectors of Q1, Q2 and Q3 are R1, R2 and R3 respectively. First, I'm going to write down the force acting on Q1 due to Q2, and this will be nothing but F12. This I know I can write down by Coulomb's law that this will be the force acting on 1 due to 2, and I get the answer for this force using Coulomb's law. Similarly, I can also write down the force acting on Q1 due to Q3, and this will give me the force F13, whose value again will be derived from Coulomb's law. Now remember, whenever I was taking the force acting on Q1 due to a particular charge, I was completely ignoring the other charge. Now I have two terms. One is the force acting on Q1 due to Q2, and one is the force acting on Q1 due to Q3. That is, I have F12 and F13. I will add them vectorially. To do this, I will apply the parallelogram law. I will complete the parallelogram and I get the resultant vector, that is the resultant force acting on Q1 due to both Q2 and 3 is F1. And as you can see, I have used the parallelogram law geometrically. And when I apply this parallelogram law, I can find the magnitude of this force by the parallelogram law. Let's say that the angle between F13 and F12 is theta, and alpha is the final angle that the net force F1 makes with F12. In such a case, from the formulae of parallelogram law, we get that the magnitude of the resultant force of the two electric forces is given by F net is equal to root F1 square plus F2 square plus 2 F1 F2 cos theta. You will recognize that this is the same law we used in the parallelogram law. And we have tan alpha, that is, it is giving us the direction of the resultant vector. Tan alpha is equal to F2 sin theta upon F1 plus F2 cos theta. So this way we get the resultant vector in case of multiple charges. This is known as a superposition principle. I can extend this principle to a general case where instead of having just 2 charges, I could have 100, and each time what I have to do is find out the force acting on this charge due to one other charge by ignoring the rest, then do that for every other pair and add them all up vectorially. Next, we want to talk about what is known as the electric field. Now, we know that whenever a charge is placed at some point, there will be an electric field around it. But what exactly does this mean? This means that let's say I have a charge plus Q kept at the origin, and I take a small test charge and place it at some point near this bigger charge, then this small charge is going to experience a force due to this bigger charge. Now, what does this mean? The fact that this small charge experiences a force tells me that this bigger charge has an electric field around it. Because we are not really touching them with each other, are we? We are not. And still, even then, the small charge is experiencing some force because of this bigger charge, and this tells me that there is an electric field around the bigger charge. So now we see what is meant by an electric field. Basically, the area around the charge where this any other test charge placed will experience a force is known as the electric field of charge plus Q. So I say that in general, the charge will not feel any force, but when it reaches a certain position, a certain distance from a point charge, for example, then in that area it will start feeling a force due to this capital Q charge. And therefore, we see that electric and magnetic fields can only be detected by their effects, that is, by their forces on charges. We can't really see this field, and therefore we say that the electric field is nothing but the area around the charge where its presence or effects are felt. So why is the concept of field even important? The concept of field is what explains the interaction between the two charges. A charge using the field exerts a force on the other charge, and the same thing happens in the other way around. Therefore, the interaction between charges takes place through the field. Now, we can also use the same logic with the electrostatic force, but a field is a good concept to understand electrostatics geometrically or pictorially. So let's see how electric field can help us. By definition, like I said, it is the space around a charge in which the electric force due to that charge can be experienced. And from here we get the formula for the electric field due to a point charge. So the formula for the electric field due to a point charge is given by E is equal to 1 upon 4 pi epsilon naught capital Q upon R square R cap. Capital Q is the charge on the point charge. Now you can see that this is a vector equation, and therefore this tells you that E is in the same direction as the radial vector, and therefore this field has radial symmetry. We will see this geometrically very shortly. We already know R cap is the unit vector from the origin to the point wherever you want to find the effect of this electric field, and R cap by definition, because it's a unit vector, will be given by R bar upon R, where R bar is the vector itself and R bar is its magnitude. Now we already know the formula for the Coulomb force. The Coulomb force we recently learned due to a charge capital Q on a small charge q is given by this formula, that is F bar is equal to 1 upon 4 pi epsilon naught capital Q into small q divided by r square, where r is the distance between them, and r cap, which is again the radial vector. So using equations 1 and 2, I can write down the relationship between the Coulomb force and the electric field, and it comes out to be that F is equal to QE, and conversely I can write that E is equal to F upon Q. Now I want you to take this time out and note something very important. E is independent of the small charge Q. How is it that the E is independent of the small charge Q when Q actually appears in the equation? This is because F itself also has the small charge Q, and if you divide that by small charge Q, the small charge Q cancels out, and the final formula for E will have no small charge Q. So it doesn't matter which charge you place at the point, the electric field is independent of the magnitude of the charge you are placing. It only depends upon the magnitude of the charge which is exerting the electric field, and it depends on the distance between them. Also remember that whenever you have a positive charge, the electric field is always radiating outward. So this is a positive point charge. It has a radially outward field. The electric field is outward from the charge. Conversely, for a negative charge, the field will be radially inward. So we say that if the source charge is negative, the electric field vector at each point points radially inward. Finally, I also want to say that charges that lie at the same distance from the point charge will experience the magnitude of the electric field exactly the same. For example, in this case, the charges which lie on the same circle, that is A, B and D, will experience the same magnitude of electric field, while the others will experience a different magnitude. So we see that at equal distances from a point charge, the magnitude of its electric field E is same. In other words, it has a spherical symmetry. This is actually obvious from the formula itself. It is only dependent on R, and therefore it has radial symmetry. Finally, I also want to say that electric field also follows the superposition principle just like the force does. So in this case, if I had 4 charges and I had to find out the total electric field acting at point P, then what I would do is find out the electric field on point P due to the first charge, that is E1. Then I would find the electric field on P due to the second one, that is E2. Then I would find that on P due to the third charge and the fourth charge, and so on and so forth. In this case, when I try to vectorially add them, I will see that E1 and E2, I complete the parallelogram and I get the resultant vector of E1 and E2. Then I add this resultant vector and E3, so I complete that parallelogram and I get this resultant vector. Finally, I add this resultant and E4, that I complete that parallelogram and I get the final resultant vector for the electric field at point P. So you can see all I have done is vectorially add the electric field due to each of them. So again, just like for forces, we can use the superposition principle, which says that the total field E is nothing but the addition, vectorial addition of each of the fields. So it's E1 bar plus E2 bar plus E3 bar plus E4 bar, and so on and so forth. Each of these fields only depend on the position of the point charge. A clever way of representing electric field is by drawing electric field lines. So we say that electric field lines are a pictorial representation of the electric field. So how will you draw electric field lines? Let's say that you have a charge. You assume that this charge is placed at the origin. So that's the first step to drawing the electric field lines. The second step is that you start drawing lines, that is, you start drawing vectors pointing in the direction of the electric field. And remember that the length of these vectors should be proportional to the field strength at that point. For example, the space very close to this charge will have a strong electric field strength, and therefore I will draw these arrows. Firstly, they are radially outwards because we know that the field of a point charge, a positive point charge, is radially outward. And secondly, as you can see, these arrows are long because the electric field near the charge will be very strong, and therefore we have drawn long arrows. But as we go away from the electric charge, you will see that the length of the arrows drawn is reducing. This is because the strength of the electric field is reducing, because the electric field is inversely proportional to the distance, and therefore you can see that the arrows drawn away, that is in the second round of arrows, are shorter as compared to the first round of arrows. Finally, we are drawing another round of arrows and the strength has reduced, so the length of the arrow has also reduced even further. It is important to note that such a pictorial representation not only gives me the direction of the electric field, it also tells me how strong or how weak the electric field is. So you can see very clearly that the electric field reduces in strength when we go from near the charge to far away from the charge. The exact opposite takes place in case of a negative charge. In case of a negative charge, the arrows will point inwards, as we have seen before, and here the arrows have very small lengths far away from the field because the strength of the electric field is very less, and as you come closer and closer to the charge, you will see that the length increases because the field around the negative charge closest to it will be the strongest, and therefore again you can see that the arrows close to the charge are the longest, while the arrows away from the charge are shorter. It increases as we move towards the electric charge. So this is the way in which we draw the electric field using vectors which indicate the direction, and their lengths are proportional to the electric field strength. But there is also one other way in which we can draw the electric field. This other way means that you must just join all these lines together, and this is also one way of pictorially representing the electric field. So as always, you can see that the direction is still clearly seen. In case of the positive charge, the arrows are pointing outwards, and in case of the negative charge, the arrows are pointing inward. But the most important question is, can I still tell whether the electric field is strong or weak just by looking at this diagram? The answer is yes. But now what you have to see, before we were looking at the lengths to check if it is a strong or weak electric field, now what you have to see is the space between the lines, which is nothing but the density of the lines. You will see that very close to the charge, the lines are densely packed. The space between them is less, whereas as you go away from the charge, the space between them is increasing. So we say that the density of lines in such a type of diagram will tell me the strength of the electric field. So even this diagram can tell me whether the electric field is strong or weak at a particular place. Finally, we will also see that what are the properties of field lines. The first and most important property is that field lines always start from positive charges and end at a negative charge. So the question is, what happens if I have a single charge? If we have a single charge, then that charge, if it's positive, then the electric field lines will start from that single charge and go up to infinity. And if it's a negative charge, the lines will come from infinity towards the negative charge. So we say that if there is a single charge, electric field lines may start or end at infinity. The second property is that the tangent drawn at the electric field line at any point will give me the direction of the electric field at that point. The third property is that electric field lines cannot cross each other. So this diagram in which these two lines are crossing each other is absolutely wrong because they are not allowed to cross each other. The fourth property is that electrostatic field lines do not form any closed loops. They are open loops, and therefore you'll never be able to see the end of the loop. The final property of the electric field line is that if you have a uniform field, then you must draw parallel lines, and parallel straight lines are the way of drawing a uniform electric field. So the field that we saw before, that is the field of the point charge, those lines were not parallel, so obviously that was not a uniform field. Uniform fields will always be depicted by parallel straight lines. Next, we want to learn about the motion of a charged particle at rest in an electric field. Now remember, a charged particle itself will also have an electric field. But here we are not talking about the motion of the charge due to the field of itself. Here we are talking about the motion of the charged particle in an external electric field, which means even before the charge was there, this electric field was present. So let's say that this external electric field was generated due to a nearby charge like capital plus Q, and this charge is giving us the external electric field. In this electric field, we have a charge which is initially at rest. We already know that because of the mutual repulsion in this case, or in general also, this charge will experience a force due to the bigger charge plus Q. That is, in an external field, a point charge or any charge will experience a force which will make it go or move in the direction of the field. So the particle will experience an electric force which will cause its motion. We already know that the force acting on this particle will be constant in magnitude, that is F is equal to Q into E. We know that this is the formula for the force, and from this we can find out what will be the acceleration of this charge. The acceleration of this charge as it moves from t is equal to 0 to t is equal to t will be given simply by Newton's law, that is F by m, and we know F is QE, so I get that A is equal to QE by m. This means that an electric charge which is moving under the force of an electric field will accelerate as it moves. Keep in mind that the acceleration is constant, but it still means that the velocity is increasing as it moves from point P to point Q. Let's now try to find out what is the velocity. To find the velocity, all we have to understand is that as it goes from time t is equal to 0, which is initially at rest, it moves towards point Q, it gets faster and faster, and at point Q, let's say that its velocity is v. We use the equation of motion v is equal to u plus at to find velocity. U is 0 because the particle is initially at rest. A we can get from the first equation, that is QE by m, and t is the final time t because initial time we took as 0. So we write v is equal to 0 plus QET by m, and this gives me v is equal to QET by m, that is the value of the velocity of the charged particle after a time t. Using this, I can also find the momentum. We know P is equal to mv. We already have m, and v we get from equation 2. So we get that the momentum of this particle in an external electric field is equal to QET. The m cancels out. So the momentum is independent of the mass of the charge. Finally, we can also find the kinetic energy. It's very straightforward. We know that the formula for kinetic energy is half mv square. So we get half m, and we substitute the value for v from equation 2, and this gives me that the kinetic energy K can be written as Q square E square T square divided by 2m. Once I have the kinetic energy, I can also find out what is the work done by the electric field in moving this electric charge. The work done by the electric field will be nothing but the gain in kinetic energy. We know this from the work energy theorem. Work done is equal to the gain in kinetic energy. But we also know another formula for work done, that is W is equal to Q delta V, where delta V is the potential difference between the two positions of charge Q. We will see what delta V, that is, we will see what potential difference is shortly. For now, just remember that work done also has an extra formula, that is W is equal to Q delta V, and delta V can also be written as the dot product of the electric field E and R, that is delta V is equal to E dot R, which is ER cos theta. Using equations 1 and 2, I get W is equal to Q, and I substitute the value of delta V from equation 2, and I get W is equal to Q E dot R. So we get the formula for the work done by the electrostatic force is Q into E dot R. One special case of the motion of a charged particle in an electric field is when the charged particle enters at 90 degrees to the direction of the electric field. So let's say, for example, the electric field exists along the y-axis. This electric field is then obviously at 90 degrees to the x-axis, and I'm saying that a charged particle is entering this electric field at 90 degrees, that is along the x-axis. And as you can see, the charged particle underwent a parabolic path. Therefore, we say that when a charged particle enters perpendicularly in an electric field, it describes a parabolic path. From here, I can write down the equation of trajectory. To write down the equation of trajectory, I must analyze the velocity of this particle inside the electric field at any point P. At any point P, this particle will have a velocity along some random direction V, which can be resolved into two directions, that is Vy and Vx. Let's say that the initial velocity of the particle, which was only along x-axis, is u, and the initial velocity of the particle along y-axis is obviously 0 because all the velocity initially was along the x-axis. Vx and Vy here represents the final velocity at point P of this particle. From here, I can say that throughout the motion, the particle will have uniform velocity along the x direction. Why is that? Because electric field is not acting along the x direction, and therefore the velocity of the particle along the x direction will not change. And so if I want to find out the distance covered by the particle along the x direction, I simply have to write down velocity into time, which will give me the distance traveled along the x-axis. And we know the initial velocity was u, and because there's no electric field acting along the x-axis, the final velocity at point P, Vx, is also u. Multiply that by the time duration, that is t. So I get the distance traveled along the x-axis is x is equal to ut. Similarly, if I try to analyze the situation along the y-axis, there will be a different situation because the electric field is present along the y-axis. And because of the presence of this electric field, the velocity of the particle will change. Now, initially the velocity of the particle along the y-axis was 0 because it came along the x-axis, and initial velocity along the y-axis was therefore 0. So I can say that y is equal to half qe by m x by u the whole square. Where did I get this from? I know that y is equal to ut plus half at square is the equation of motion. Initial velocity along the y direction was 0, so u became 0. So this is actually my expression for half at square, where a is qe by m, which we just saw a few minutes ago, and t comes from the above equation, that is x is equal to ut. This gave me the equation of trajectory, and you can clearly see that in this equation y is directly proportional to x square, which should tell you that the shape you are about to get, that the motion that the particle is about to take is going to be a parabola, because the equation of a parabola has y proportional to x square. Now finally, I also want to write down the equation for the velocity at any instant of time. So to find the velocity at any instant, we simply have to use the parallelogram law. Let's say I have Vx, Vy and V, and let's say that the final angle that V is making with Vx is beta. The angle between Vx and Vy is clearly 90 degrees because they are vector components of the same vector. So now I can say that at any instant t, Vx is equal to u because it's not changing. Initially it was u and finally also it's u, and Vy is equal to qet by m. We saw a few minutes earlier what is the velocity of a particle in an electric field which is parallel to the particle. We just saw it a few minutes earlier, and I'm using that formula here. So Vx is u and Vy is equal to qet by m. Now I just apply the parallelogram law. That is, I'll get the magnitude of the vector by just squaring and adding its components and taking the square root. So Vx square plus Vy square is added, and then you take the square root. So I get u square plus q square e square t square upon m square, and the whole square root will give me the magnitude of the velocity vector at any instant. Remember, Vx and Vy are at 90 degrees. So even if you think about this from the parallelogram law point of view, the angle is 90, and therefore you are left only with Vx square plus Vy square. Finally, to find the direction of the final vector, that is velocity vector at any instant t, then you have to use again the formula that tan beta is equal to the y component upon the x component, that is Vy upon Vx, and you get qet by mu. So this way you can find the direction and you can find the magnitude of the velocity vector at any instant t when it is moving in an electric field perpendicular to the direction of the electric field. For the case of the electric field, we define a quantity similar to liquid flow, and this is known as electric flux. Electric flux by definition, is a measure of the number of field lines passing through an area. We already know from the concept of field lines that when we place an area normal to the electric field, the number of lines per unit area is a measure of the strength of the electric field at that point. This means that if I want to find the number of field lines, it will be proportional to the strength of the electric field and the area. Increasing the strength of the electric field will result in a larger number of lines passing through the area element. Similarly, increasing the area will also increase the total number of lines passing through that area element. Thus, we can say that flux depends on the electric field strength and the area S. Phi is thus proportional to E and delta S. However, if the area is held at an angle other than 90 degrees to the electric field, it is seen that the number of field lines passing through the area changes. Thus, changing the orientation changes the number of lines passing through the area. When the area element is parallel to the electric field lines, we say that the area vector is making a 90-degree angle with the field. In such a case, no flux or no field lines pass through the area element. Thus, we conclude that electric flux depends not only on E and the area, but also on the orientation of the area element, that is, on the angle between the area vector and the field. We thus define electric flux through an area element as follows. Phi is given by the dot product of the electric field vector and the area vector. Phi is thus a scalar whose magnitude is E delta S cos theta, where theta is the angle between the electric field and the outward normal to the area element. This basic definition of electric flux can in principle be used to calculate the total flux through any given surface. All we have to do is divide the surface into small area elements, find the flux for each of these elements and add them up. Thus, the total electric flux is a summation of the flux calculated for each of the elements. In the continuous case, when the number of elements approaches infinity and the area of each of the elements approaches zero, the sum changes into an integral. It is then obvious that maximum flux flows through an area when it is placed normal to the field. This means that the angle is zero. Similarly, when the angle between the area vector and E is 90, the electric flux is zero. The next thing that we want to talk about is the electric dipole. By definition, an electric dipole is a pair of two charges which are equal and opposite, and they are separated by a distance to A. So you can see that we have two charges plus Q and minus Q placed at points A and B separated by a distance to A, and this arrangement constitutes a dipole. The direction of the dipole is always considered to be from the negative charge to the positive charge. This is known as the direction of the dipole, denoted by P. So as you can see, P is denoted from minus Q to plus Q. Also, it's very obvious that the center of the dipole will be equidistant from the two ends, and therefore point O is the center of the dipole. Now, as you can see, overall the charge on the dipole is zero because together they will have a zero charge. But what we want to find is the electrostatic field, the value of the field strength at any point near a dipole. Now, we are only going to be looking at two special cases of the position of the point P. However, the point P in general can be anywhere with respect to the electric dipole. And in such a case, let us say that the displacement vector pointing from minus Q to P is R1, pointing from plus Q to P is R2, and that pointing from point O, that is the center of the dipole, to P is R. The angle made by R with the axis of the dipole is theta, and consequently the angle AOP will be 180 minus theta. Now, like I said, we're only looking at two special cases. The first one is when point P lies on the axis of the dipole. So in this case, I'm looking at the position where point P lies on one side, that is on the side closer to plus Q. And now I'm going to deal with this case where I'm trying to find out the electric field strength at point P. Now, it is obvious that the electric field created at point P due to the charge plus Q will be radially outward, and therefore E plus Q points towards the left. However, on the other hand, the radial field of the charge minus Q will be pointing towards minus Q and therefore points towards the right at point P. So we apply the superposition principle, that is, to find the electric field at point P, we simply add the electric field at point P due to plus Q to the electric field at point P due to minus Q. First, let's write down the electric field at point P due to the charge minus Q. In this case, as you will see, we will use the electric field for a point charge formula, and here you can see that the numerator has a minus sign. This minus sign is actually indicating the direction. We have minus P cap as the direction, because the electric field at point P due to minus Q is opposite to the direction of the dipole moment, and therefore the minus P cap is giving us the direction, that is, it is opposite to P. Also, you can see that instead of R, we have written R plus A, because the distance between point P and point B is R plus A the whole square. Similarly, I can write down the electric field at point P due to the charge plus Q. In this case, you will see that instead of R, we have written R minus A the whole square, because the distance between the point P and the point A is equal to R minus A. Note that the distance R is the distance between the point P and the center of the dipole, as mentioned earlier. So this gives me the electric field at P due to A and the electric field at P due to B, and I simply add them using the superposition principle to get the total field at P. But remember, we have to add them vectorially, and once I do that, I get the final value of the electric field at point P, which is just a general point on the axis of the dipole, and that will be Q upon 4 pi epsilon naught 4AR upon R square minus A square the whole square, and P cap gives me the direction of the electric field. We can also simplify this equation further by considering that the distance of point P from the center of the dipole is very large. That is, I say R is much greater than A. In that case, I can ignore the A in the denominator and I'll get R4 in the denominator, and the R in the numerator will cancel with 1 R in the denominator to give me the simplified equation, that is 4QA upon 4 pi epsilon naught R cube, and P cap is the direction, and this is the equation for a short dipole, that is when R is much greater than A. So this was for a point P on the axis. What happens when point P lies on the equatorial plane? This is our second special case. In case of point P lying on the equatorial plane, we will again apply the same logic. Here again we say that R is the distance of point P from the center of the dipole, that is O, and we will find the electric field due to each of them and add it up. But one very important thing is different in this case. In this case, as we can see, in the equatorial plane, the line OP is perpendicular, that is, the plane is perpendicular to the axis of the dipole. And because this plane is perpendicular to the axis of the dipole, the hypotenuse, that is AP and PB, both have the same magnitudes, and therefore, because both the charges are equidistant from the point P, in fact they are equidistant from any point on the equatorial plane, and because both the charges have the same magnitude, what happens is that the magnitude of the electric field due to any of the charges at point P is exactly the same, and it is given by Q upon 4 pi epsilon naught 1 upon R square plus A square, because R square plus A square is the value of the distance of any charge from point P. So actually here both of them are affecting the point P with the same magnitude. So here I say E plus Q and E minus Q have the same magnitudes. Now all I have to do is add them vectorially. In order to add them vectorially, first I will notice that the angle between AP and the axis of the dipole is theta, and the distance OP is R. Now I will say that the electric field at point P due to charge plus Q is outward direction, and now I will resolve this into its two components, that is E plus Q sine theta and E plus Q cos theta. Similarly, the electric field at point P due to minus Q will be towards minus Q because it's a negative charge. In this case also I will resolve them into two components, that is E minus Q sine theta and E minus Q cos theta. I will see that the perpendicular components cancel away and the only components that remain are the cos theta components, and therefore the total resultant of the electric field due to plus Q and minus Q at point P comes out to be E plus Q cos theta plus E minus Q cos theta. So we see that the components normal to the dipole just cancelled away and the components along the dipole axis will be added up, and therefore the total electric field, which will be nothing but E plus Q cos theta plus E minus Q cos theta, will be found. Also note that the total electric field is opposite to P cap, and therefore we say that E bar, which is the total field at point P, is minus E plus Q plus E minus Q cos theta P cap. The minus comes from the fact that it is opposite to P cap. Therefore, we get the final answer, that is electric field is equal to 2qa upon 4 pi epsilon naught r square plus a square the whole raised to 3 by 2 and P cap. Finally, I want to say that at large distances, like we did before, we will again simplify this equation. That is, for r much greater than a, the denominator a square will be neglected, and this will give me that E cap is equal to minus 2qa upon 4 pi epsilon naught r cube P cap. This is again the formula for a short dipole. I also want to define what is known as the dipole moment vector P for an electric dipole. The dipole moment vector P for an electric dipole is denoted as P bar and is given by Q into 2A, and its direction is along P cap. So using this equation, I will rewrite the equations for the short dipole, that is, the equations in the brackets can be rewritten in terms of P bar, and then I will see that for the points on the axis, the equation becomes E bar is equal to 2P upon 4 pi epsilon naught r cube, and for the points on the equatorial plane, the field becomes E cap is equal to minus P bar upon 4 pi epsilon naught r cube. Again, these are the equations for a short dipole only. So what we have found is the electric field at any point on the axis and at any point on the equatorial plane of a dipole, and we have found them for a short dipole, and we have also defined what is the electric dipole moment. Finally, I want you to notice that the electric field of a dipole falls off, that is proportional to 1 upon r cube, whereas the electric field of a point charge was proportional to 1 upon r square. This is important because this means that the dipole field falls off faster than the field of a point charge. Finally, also remember that the magnitude and direction of the dipole field depends not only on the distance r, but also on the angle between the position vector r bar and the dipole moment P bar. And therefore, I can also write another formula for the electric field strength, that is 1 upon 4 pi epsilon naught k P by r cube root 3 cos square theta plus 1. This is written in terms of theta so that you can put the value of theta depending upon where P is around the electric dipole. This formula is written in terms of the angle theta, and therefore you can find the value of the electric field strength by putting it the appropriate value of theta. Next, I want to talk about what happens when you place a dipole in a uniform external electric field. So let's say that I have a dipole placed with some angle to the x-axis. In such a case, let me assume that the electric field is towards the right. Remember this case here, we are discussing the electric field which is uniform, and therefore we are discussing dipole in a uniform external field. As you can see, we have drawn the electric field as straight parallel lines to denote that this electric external field is completely uniform. Now, it's obvious that when this dipole will be placed in an external electric field, each of these charges are going to experience a force. The charge plus Q will experience a force in the direction of the field, whereas the charge minus Q of the dipole will experience a force opposite to the direction of the field. Now, the magnitude of both these forces, however, will be exactly the same. Let's say that this dipole makes an angle theta with the x-axis, that is, it makes an angle theta with the direction of the electric field. The separation between the two charges we know is 2a. Now, the force acting on each of these charges, even though is opposite, is the same in magnitude. It is given by Q into E, and we know that Q is the same and E is the same, and therefore the magnitude of the force is exactly the same. Now, we have to consider two things. What happens when these two forces are acting on the dipole? The first question is, will the dipole as a whole move? The answer is no. This is because equal and opposite forces are acting along the x direction, and therefore the dipole as a whole will not move. However, the next question is, are these forces acting along the same line? And the answer is no. These forces are not acting along the same line. And we know from rotation that when you have two equal and opposite forces which are not acting along the same line, they produce what is known as a torque. And therefore we say that the net force on the dipole may be zero, but there is torque acting on the dipole which will try to turn the dipole in such a way that it gets aligned with the electric field. So the question is, what is the magnitude of this torque? To answer that, let's see what is happening in the diagram. If I complete the triangle, that is, I complete the triangle between minus Q and plus Q and the x-axis, I will see that the opposite side of the hypotenuse will be 2a sine theta, and this side is what I need, that is the moment arm that I need. It's the perpendicular distance between the lines of actions of both the forces, and therefore by the definition of torque I will get that the torque acting on the dipole is QE into 2a sine theta, which is 2qa e sine theta. This can be written in terms of the dipole moment vector, and therefore I get that tau is equal to Pe sine theta. Now remember, what is this tau trying to do? That is, what is the torque trying to do? It's trying to rotate the dipole. And how long will it rotate the dipole? It will rotate it till this dipole is aligned with the electric field. So tau, which is given by the cross product between P and E, is basically trying to align the dipole with the electric field. Once the dipole moment is aligned with the electric field, the net torque will become 0 because the theta will be 0 and sine theta is 0. So tau, which is Pe sine theta, will become 0. So the torque tends to align the dipole with the field E, and when P is aligned with E, the net torque is 0. Which also means that whenever you place a dipole in an external electric field, there is always a tendency that the dipole will try to turn. That means if you externally want to turn the dipole in the opposite direction, you will have to do some work. So let's see what is the work done in trying to rotate the dipole which is placed in an external field. The dipole is already experiencing a torque which is trying to rotate it so that it gets aligned with E, and therefore when you try to rotate it in the opposite direction, you will also have to do some work. Let's say that initially the dipole was at an orientation of theta 1 with respect to the electric field. Now, I will say that the work done in rotating this dipole from the initial angle theta 1 to a new angle theta 2 is given by the formula W is equal to Pe cos theta 1 minus cos theta 2. Now, in this formula, the term Pe cos theta, this term actually represents potential energy of the dipole, which means Pe cos theta 1 is the initial potential energy and Pe cos theta 2 is the final potential energy. And I can also write down the work done in rotation as U1 minus U2, that is initial potential energy minus final potential energy. And this you can see is the minus of delta U, because delta is always calculated as final minus initial. So I also get another formula that W is equal to minus delta U, or the work done in rotating a dipole is the negative of the change in its potential energy. So basically, if we place a dipole in a uniform external field, we saw that there is no net force acting on it, but there is a torque. And why was there no net force acting on the dipole? Because the field was uniform, which meant that the force acting on each of the charges was equal and opposite. However, if you place a dipole in a non-uniform external field, what exactly will be the difference? The difference will be that in a non-uniform external field, the magnitude of the force acting on each of the charges will not be exactly the same, and therefore there will be a net force acting on the charges. Of course, there will still be a torque just like before. So this time it means that if I place a dipole in a non-uniform external field, there will not only be a torque acting on it, but there will also be a net force, which means not only will the dipole rotate, but the dipole will also move. Now here we are going to only understand this qualitatively, and we are only going to look at a very simple case wherein there is no torque, which means the dipole is already along the direction of the external field. That means that I am going to look at two cases, one where it is aligned parallel to the external field and the other when it is aligned anti-parallel to the external field. Remember that the field is non-uniform. So as you can see, we have pictorially represented a non-uniform external field. The number of plus signs on my right are less, indicating that the electric field to my right is weak, whereas the number of plus signs to my left are more, indicating that the electric field strength on my left is strong. This obviously indicates a non-uniform external field. In this non-uniform external field, I place the dipole. So you can see I have placed the minus q charge in the region of the weak electric field and the plus q charge in the region of the strong electric field. As I have already mentioned before, the direction of the increasing strength of the electric field will be from the right to the left, because the field is strong on the left and weak on the right. Now we already know that the net force acting on a dipole in a non-uniform external field will not be zero, because the magnitude of the force acting on each of these charges will not be exactly equal. Let's see the force acting on which of these charges is greater. If I write down the electric field and the direction and strength of the force due to the electric field acting on charge minus q will obviously be much less because it is in a region of the weak electric field, whereas the force acting on the charge plus q will obviously be much greater because it is closer to a region of strong electric field. And therefore, I can say that the net force is acting in the direction of the increasing field. Therefore, the net force, which you can see is towards the left, is acting in the direction of the electric field, which is also increasing towards the left. Exactly opposite is the situation if I switched the places of the positive and negative charges, that is, if the dipole was at 180 degrees with respect to the electric field. In this case, I have placed the plus q charge in the region of weak electric field and the minus q charge in the region of strong electric field. This time, we will see that the increasing direction of the electric field is again from right to left, and now we will see that the force acting on the charge plus q is much less as compared to the force acting on the charge minus q. In this case, now the net force is acting in the direction opposite to the direction of the electric field, and you can see that the net force is therefore towards the right and the electric field is increasing towards the left. Also, you can see that this actually depends on the orientation of the dipole moment. So we say that in general, the force acting on a dipole in a non-uniform external field depends upon the orientation of P bar with respect to E bar. So far we have seen how to calculate the electric field at a single point due to either a single charge or due to a large number of discrete charges. But what happens when we have a continuous distribution of charge? What does this mean? Discrete charges are charges which are separated from each other that you can count on your hands. Continuous distribution of charges is a system where there are a large number of charges closely arranged, that is closely packed. For example, if I tell you that this rod has charge, can you identify one charge from the other? You cannot. So this rod is a system of closely spaced charges, and therefore this is a continuous distribution of charges. So I say that by definition, a system of closely spaced electric charges forms a continuous charge distribution. In this case, what we have to do is come up with a new way to find the electric field due to this entire rod. And to come up with this new way, we have to introduce the idea of the density of a charge. If you have a rod or any object which is one-dimensional, in this case we will say that you cut up this charged rod into small pieces and then first try to answer what is the field due to one small piece. Now look at this small piece. Here we say that this small piece, it makes up only delta L of the length of the entire conductor, that is the length of the entire rod. So the length of this small piece is delta L, and we say that the charge in this small piece is delta Q, and then we define the density of the charge per unit length, that is we define what is known as lambda for a wire or for a one-dimensional object, and it is given simply by charge per unit length. So I get lambda is equal to delta Q by delta L. So remember, what we did was look at one small piece of the entire wire or the entire rod, where delta L was a small element of the wire and delta Q was the charge contained in that small line element. We continue with this treatment if we have a two-dimensional object, that is if I have an area. This time I will cut up the elements into small area pieces. For a rod or a wire, I cut it up into pieces of line elements. For an area or a two-dimensional element, I will cut it up into small pieces of area elements. So here I take a small piece of this big square plate and I say that this small piece or this small area element has an area delta S, and in this small element is a charge of delta Q, and here for an area or a two-dimensional element I will define the surface charge density, which is delta Q by delta S, given by the symbol sigma. So sigma is the surface charge density delta Q by delta S. Finally, I will also define what is known as the volume charge density. In this case now I have a three-dimensional object. A three-dimensional object will have volume, and therefore I will cut it up into small volume elements, and then I will see that each of these volume elements will have some charge, and we will define what is known as the volume charge density, or sometimes simply called as the charge density because it's the most common one. Again, I will take only one element, that is one volume element, and I will say that in this volume element is a volume delta V and the charge contained is delta Q, and I define the volume charge density as delta Q by delta V. Let me remind you that the most important thing to understand is that A, we are looking at a situation where there is a continuous distribution of charges. Secondly, if you have a one-dimensional object, you define the linear charge density, that is charge per unit length. If you have a two-dimensional object, you define surface charge density, and if you have a three-dimensional object, you define the volume charge density. Now the question is, what do I do by defining these charge densities? How do I finally find the electric field due to such an object? So the answer is that even if you have a continuous distribution of charges, you can still simply use the superposition principle. I have this three-dimensional object, I will break it up into volume elements, and therefore I will see that even for objects which have continuous distribution of charges, I can still use the superposition principle. I take one piece of this volume element and I ask how much charge is inside this volume element. As you know, we have just defined the volume charge density. The volume charge density rho was given by delta Q by delta V, which means I can write delta Q as rho delta V. And therefore, in this small volume element is the charge delta Q equal to rho delta V. Now I will apply the superposition principle. What I do is first try to find out the electric field due to this one small volume element at the point P, and then I will add the electric field due to all of these elements at the same point P, and when I add them vectorially, I will get the answer I need. So here let me first draw an origin system, that is I draw a coordinate system and I say that at point P I want to find the electric field. First I try to find the electric field at point P due to this small volume element, and I say that the position vector of the small volume element with respect to the origin is r, and the distance between this volume element which contains the charge and point P is r dash, and the distance between, that is the position vector of the point P, is r. Now, we already know the formula for finding the electric field at a point due to a point charge, that is 1 upon 4 pi epsilon naught q by r square. Here instead of q, we have written delta q, which is rho delta v, because I am using the small volume element and that has a charge of rho delta v, and I am dividing that by the distance between this volume element and point P, that is r dash square. So here as you can see, r dash is the distance between the charge element and point P, and r dash vector is the unit vector in the direction from the charge element to point P, and the electric field therefore points towards the right. But this electric field is not E, it is delta E, because it is the electric field only due to one small element. So if I want to find the total electric field due to all the elements, that is due to the entire object, then one by one I'll have to add up all the delta E's, and together they will give me the electric field at point P, and therefore I say that by the superposition principle, the total electric field due to the charge distribution is obtained by summing over electric fields due to different volume elements, and so my formula changes, delta E becomes E, but then I have also written a summation sign, which means that you have to do this for all the volume elements, and then when you go under the limit that delta V is tending to 0, that is as the volume elements get smaller and smaller and smaller, you will see that the number of elements becomes infinite, and when that happens, your summation sign changes to an integration sign, and therefore you get that the electric field due to a volume charge distribution is 1 upon 4 pi epsilon naught rho dV upon r dash square. This is under the integral sign and the direction is r dash. Similarly, now I can write down the general formula by understanding that the numerator after the integral includes the charge element and the denominator includes the distance from the charge element and the point P. So when I write this for the surface charge distribution, instead of rho dV, I will just simply write sigma ds, and when I write that for the linear charge distribution, that is for the line, wire or the rod, I will just have, instead of rho dV or sigma ds, I have lambda dl. Otherwise, the formula remains exactly the same, and that's how you can see that superposition principle is so powerful that you can use it even for a continuous charge distribution. An important application of the concept of electric flux is Gauss's law. Gauss's law simply states that the electric flux through a closed surface is equal to the total charge enclosed by the surface S divided by epsilon naught. As it is clear, the left-hand side of Gauss's law deals with electric flux. Gauss's law provides an easier way to find the electric field in some simple symmetric charge configurations. From Gauss's law, it is evident that if no charge is enclosed in the surface, then the flux passing through it is zero. The surface chosen to calculate the above surface integral is known as a Gaussian surface. It is then clear that since the left-hand side of the Gauss's law equation deals with electric flux, it is important that we understand how to calculate the electric flux for some important examples. If we have an infinitely long straight wire, you will see that the electric field is radial everywhere. Moreover, this field cuts the wire normally, and its magnitude depends only on the radial distance r. In this case, we will make use of a cylindrical Gaussian surface as shown. Since no electric field lines pass through the two ends of the Gaussian surface, we say that the flux through these two ends is zero. Thus, electric flux through the whole Gaussian surface is merely equal to the electric flux passing through the cylindrical part of the surface. Hence, for an infinitely long straight uniformly charged wire, if we want to apply Gauss's law, we will only consider the flux passing through the cylindrical part of the surface. Let us now take a look at a uniformly charged infinite plane sheet. As you can see, the electric field of the plane sheet is parallel to the x-axis only. It is independent of the y and z directions, and its direction at every point lies along the x-axis. In such a case, we can choose a Gaussian surface to be a rectangular parallelopiped. As is clear from the figure, only the ends of this Gaussian surface have electric field lines passing through them, and hence only these two faces will contribute to the electric flux. For all other surfaces, the electric field lines are parallel and hence do not contribute to the total flux. Thus, the electric flux for a plane sheet is calculated by finding the electric flux passing through these two ends. It is important to note that since the area vectors of the face on the left and the right are in opposite directions, the flux through both the surfaces add up. Thus, we can see that the electric flux for an infinite plane sheet can be found by adding the electric flux of the left and right faces of the Gaussian surface. Let us now take a look at the last example as an application of Gauss's law. We are trying to find the field due to a uniformly charged thin spherical shell. We will take a look at two cases. The first one is when we are trying to find the field outside the shell. In order to find the field at point P, I draw a Gaussian surface which is spherical and passes through P. It is now obvious that all the electric field lines that begin from the spherical shell pass through the Gaussian surface, and hence the Gaussian surface encloses the entire charge of the configuration. Therefore, we must consider all the electric field lines while calculating the electric flux. In the second case, when we are trying to find the field inside the shell, we take a point P at which the field has to be found and draw a Gaussian surface which is spherical and passing through P. However, since charge only resides at the surface of a conductor, this Gaussian surface encloses no charge. Since the right-hand side of Gauss's law depends only on the charge enclosed, this means that the electric field comes out to be zero. Thus, you can see that because the flux through the surface is zero, we can conclude that the field due to a uniformly charged thin shell is zero at all points inside the shell. But the integrals involved in trying to find the electric field strength due to a continuous charge distribution can get really complicated, and therefore we use a quicker way to find the electric field strength, that is the Gauss's law. So let's see how we can apply Gauss's law to certain specific shapes. So the first thing you must understand is that Gauss's law is usually used when the situation has some kind of symmetry. So for these symmetric charge configurations, Gauss's law will give a simpler and quicker way to find the electric field strength. Let's say in the first case, I have an infinitely long wire which is charged. So in this case, I want to find the electric field strength at a point P away from the wire. Let's say that the charge density, that is the linear charge density of this wire, is lambda, and I'm trying to find the electric field strength due to this wire at point P. Now, although we have drawn a finite wire, remember I am talking about an infinitely long charged wire. So I start with the same analysis as I have been saying for the superposition principle for a continuous charge distribution. Let's say that the distance of the point P is r from the center O of the wire. Now remember that since the wire is infinite, there is no such thing as a center actually, and therefore P is actually situated anywhere. So let's say that the distance of the point P is r from the axis of the wire. Now we take a small element and try to find out what is the direction of the electric field acting at point P due to this small element. And as you can see, the direction is indicated by the red arrow. However, since it is symmetric about the axis, there will always be some other element below the OP axis which will also have an effect at point P and whose electric field will be as shown by the second red arrow. If I try to resolve both these red arrows and find the component of the electric field due to each of these elements, P1 and P2 at point P, I will see that when I resolve the electric field due to these two elements, the perpendicular components of these two elements cancel out. And the only component remaining which acts at point P is the component which is parallel to the OP axis. Therefore, I say that the electric fields produced by the two elements of the pair when summed give a resultant electric field which is radial, and the components normal to the radial vector all cancel out. However, since it is an infinite wire and since it is symmetrical about the x-axis, you can see that for every element which is on top, there will always be an element below which will produce the same effect as that of P1 and P2, and therefore for all these elements, if we try to find out the electric field, we will see that all the perpendicular components cancel out and the only component that remains is the radial component. Finally, you must also remember that since it is an infinite wire, it really doesn't matter where point P is. No matter where the point P is, there will always be an infinite wire above it and an infinite wire below it, and therefore point P will always have a symmetrical viewpoint with respect to this infinitely charged wire, and therefore overall the electric field will always point towards the right as shown. So therefore we say that since the wire is infinite, electric field does not depend on the position of P at all, and therefore actually the point P is an arbitrary point, and we can continue this discussion forward. So finally, I say that the electric field everywhere is radial in the plane cutting the wire normally, and its magnitude depends only on the distance r, that is the radial distance r of the point P. Okay, in order to apply Gauss's law, we need to find what is the Gaussian surface in this situation. The most appropriate Gaussian surface is one which is always normal to the electric field. In this case, that is for an infinitely long straight wire, the most appropriate Gaussian surface is a cylinder. Now we will apply Gauss's law. We already saw that the electric field emanating from this long infinite wire will be radially outwards. The two ends of the cylinder, that is the top and bottom ends of the cylinder, do not see any electric field passing through them, and therefore we say that since the field is radial everywhere, the flux through the two ends of the cylindrical Gaussian surface is zero. The electric field only passes through the curved portion of the cylinder. At the cylindrical part of the surface, the electric field is normal to the Gaussian surface at every point. That's exactly why we chose a cylinder, and therefore we will see that we can directly use Gauss's law, and the magnitude of the field is constant and it depends only on r, and therefore we will use Gauss's law only for the flux passing through the curved surface, and it will be given by E into 2 pi RL, because 2 pi RL is the surface area of the curved part of the surface. So I can say that the flux through the entire surface is actually just the flux through the curved surface, because no flux passes from the up and down surfaces. And this will be equal to E into 2 pi r L. Finally, I will apply Gauss's law, which says that the flux passing through any surface is equal to the charge enclosed divided by epsilon naught. So I say that E into 2 pi r L will be simply equal to the charge enclosed, but the charge enclosed is lambda into L, because lambda is charge per unit length. So the charge enclosed is lambda L, and you divide that by epsilon naught to give you the right hand side of Gauss's law, and I get that E into 2 pi r L is equal to lambda L upon epsilon naught. This will give me the final expression for the electric field due to the infinite long wire. Now remember here that the E in this equation is actually giving me the electric field due to the entire wire, whereas the lambda L is just the charge enclosed by the surface. That's why we have taken small l, which is the length of the cylinder. Finally, I get the value of the expression, that is the electric field E is equal to lambda upon 2 pi epsilon naught r, and this is the final formula that we will get, and it came out so quickly from Gauss's law. It would have taken much longer, and it would be much harder to find it using the normal way that we were using. Vectorially, we will see that E at any point is radially outward, so I say n cap, because n cap is the radial unit vector in the plane normal to the wire passing through the point. And finally, I say that E is directed outwards only if lambda is positive, and it's inward if lambda is negative. Similarly, we can also apply Gauss's law to another symmetrical situation, that of the infinitely charged plate. In this case as well, let's say that the surface charge density of this plate is sigma, and I want to find the electric field strength at point P due to this uniformly charged infinite plane sheet. The same arguments will apply for this plane sheet. I can take two symmetrically placed elements on this plane sheet, and I will see that these elements will produce electric field at point P in such a way that their perpendicular components cancel out, and the only components that remain are along the x direction. As before, I will see that since it is an infinitely charged plane sheet, there will always be symmetrical elements all across the plate. Therefore, for all of them, the electric field will cancel out in the y direction and the z direction, and the only direction that will remain is the x direction. And therefore, I say that the total field due to an infinitely charged plane sheet will only be along the x direction. Also remember that since it is an infinite plane sheet, it doesn't matter where the point P is, because the plate will always be symmetrical with respect to the axis OP. Now from the same argument, I will now apply the Gauss's law. What I need is a Gaussian surface. In this case, I will take a rectangular parallelepiped as my Gaussian surface. Of course, you can also take a cylindrical surface. This rectangular parallelepiped has a cross-sectional area A, and remember the area vector always points away from the surface. In this case, you will see that only the surfaces which are on the left and right of the rectangular parallelepiped have flux passing through them, whereas the yellow highlighted surfaces have no flux passing through them, because the electric field is parallel to these four surfaces. And therefore, all we have to do is consider the flux passing through the left surface and the right surface and add it up, and that will give me the total flux passing through this rectangular parallelepiped. Now remember that the flux is passing through the surface on the left towards the left, and the area normal is also towards the left. Conversely, for the surface on the right, the flux is towards the right, and the direction of the normal for the area surface is also to the right, and therefore in both these cases what I will get is that the flux is equal to EA plus EA, that is, it will be given as 2EA. We also have to find the charge enclosed. It will be given as sigma A, where sigma is charge per unit area, and therefore by equating these two, I get 2EA is equal to sigma A upon epsilon naught. This is Gauss's law. I will cancel out the areas, and I will get that E is equal to sigma upon 2 epsilon naught. So we have arrived at the electric field due to a uniformly charged infinite plane sheet. Vectorially, I will say that the direction of this electric field is given by n cap, where n cap is a unit vector normal to the plane and going away from it. Finally, I will say that E is directed away from the plate if sigma is positive, and towards the plate if sigma is negative. So you can see that using Gauss's law, we quickly found the electric field strength at any point close to an infinitely charged plane sheet. In the last application of Gauss's law, we will try to find the field due to a uniformly charged thin spherical shell. Remember, it's a shell, so it's hollow on the inside. Obviously, as you can see from the figure, the situation has spherical symmetry. Now, what we want to do is first try to find out the field due to this shell at a point externally of the sphere, that is at an external point, at a point outside the sphere. In order to do this, we will choose a suitable Gaussian surface, that is, we will choose the Gaussian surface which will pass through the point P. So we are taking our Gaussian surface to be a sphere which is surrounding the shell which contains the charge and passing through point P. So we say that to calculate E at P, we take the Gaussian surface to be a sphere of radius r with center O and passing through P. Let the radius of the inner shell, that is our original shell, be capital R. The radius of this new shell is small r. Now I'm going to find the electric field at P using the idea of this Gaussian surface. As it's very clear, all the field, that is all the flux arising out of the spherical shell, passes through this Gaussian surface. You can see clearly that all the lines which start from the original spherical shell, all of them pass through this new Gaussian surface, which means that all the flux which is starting from the shell is passing through my Gaussian surface. And it is important to notice that these field lines are perpendicular to the Gaussian surface. Why is this important? Because whenever the field lines are perpendicular to the Gaussian surface, you can simply take the flux to be a product of the magnitude of the electric field and the area of the Gaussian surface. So in this case, the electric flux will come out to be simply a product of E into 4 pi r square, where 4 pi r square is the area of the Gaussian surface and E is the magnitude of the electric field. On the other side, we have the total charge on the spherical shell, because the whole spherical shell is enclosed in the Gaussian surface, and therefore charge enclosed will be the charge on the spherical shell, and therefore it is sigma 4 pi r square upon epsilon naught, where sigma 4 pi r square is the charge enclosed divided by epsilon naught is the permittivity of space. So the question is, why did I use sigma and not rho? Because it's a shell, it's not a solid sphere. From this, I can see that I get the formula for E, that is E is equal to Q upon 4 pi epsilon naught r square, and vectorially it will point in the radial direction, it will be radially outward, and therefore I have r cap to give me the direction of the electric field. Of course, the electric field is directed outward only because we consider the charge to be positive. If it was negative, the electric field would be directed inward. However, you must notice that this final answer that we got is exactly the field produced by a point charge placed at the center, and therefore we see that for points outside the shell, the field due to a uniformly charged spherical shell acts as if the entire charge is placed at the center. However, we must also look at one other case. Let's try to ask what is the field inside the shell. In order to find the field inside the shell, I take a point P inside the shell and I draw my Gaussian surface, which is nothing but a sphere which passes through point P. In this case, again, I say that the radius of the sphere is small r and the radius of the bigger shell is capital R, as we all know. If you look at it carefully, you will realize that whenever you have a conductor, you know that its charges only reside at the surface. And therefore, if you look carefully, you will see that your Gaussian surface is enclosing no charge, because all the flux firstly is not passing through it, because the electric field lines will start from the surface. Secondly, it encloses no charge because it's inside the shell and all the charge is just on the surface of the shell. And therefore, if you try to apply Gauss's law, you will simply get E into 4 pi r square is equal to 0 because there is no charge enclosed, and this will show you that the field inside the shell is 0. Therefore, we say that E is 0 for all points inside a spherical shell, and this is a direct consequence of Gauss's law, which follows from Coulomb's law. So thank you for watching this video. We take a lot of pains to bring these videos to you. If you like our channel, please click subscribe. And if you want to buy your very own target book, please click on the link given here. Please stay tuned and keep watching.